Good morning. This is David Bahnsen. Economics isn't just about money. It's about human flourishing, what people create, build, and contribute in the world God made. That's one reason I value World. Its journalism helps connect today's headlines to the deeper truths about human dignity, responsibility, and stewardship. During World's June giving drive, I hope you'll consider an investment in World's important work. WNG.org/donate. That's WNG.org/donate.
Good morning. Today on Legal Docket, the right to keep and bear arms. It is so secure that it takes more than an illegal drug charge before the government can take it away.
That is really important, not just in this Second Amendment case, but it's really important for people of faith.
Also today, the Monday Moneybeat, a new direction for the Federal Reserve. David Bahnsen standing by to discuss the new chairman's first meeting. And the World History book, How Freedom Rings.
The way the revolution lives on is through the stories that we tell about it and symbols like the Liberty Bell.
It's Monday, June 22nd. This is The World and Everything in It from listener-supported World Radio. I'm Jenny Ruff.
And I'm Nick Eicher. Good morning.
Up next, Kristen Flavin with today's news.
Vice President J.D. Vance is meeting face-to-face with Iran's leaders at a mountainside resort in Switzerland. He met Sunday with two of Iran's most senior officials, along with mediators from Pakistan and Qatar. The aim, hold Iran to its nuclear pledges and keep the Strait of Hormuz open. Vance says the president has asked negotiators to extend an outstretched hand to Iran and communicate
that if your leadership is willing to give up being a driver of regional instability, if they are willing to give up nuclear weapons ambitions for the long term, then the United States is willing to fundamentally transform our relationship.
But the White House says it remains very much a carrot and stick situation. President Trump has warned that the U.S. could hit Iran very hard again if it keeps backing Hezbollah or closes the strait. Vice President Vance on Sunday said the question now is, what can the United States and Iran accomplish together?
Can we change relations in the Middle East permanently, or do we go back to doing things the old way, which is not our preference, but is certainly very much something that can happen?
In Washington, Democrats remain skeptical. Senator Cory Booker.
We have a disaster for a commander-in-chief who's leaving us with less and less good choices. What the world needs now is leadership.
But GOP Senator Mike Lee says President Trump is, in his words, the master of the art of the deal.
I would bank on the fact that President Trump will make darn sure Iran complies, and if it doesn't, Iran will face very unpleasant consequences.
The current framework arrangement calls for 2 months of negotiations to turn the truce into a final deal. As a part of any long-term peace deal, Iran wants Israeli boots out of Lebanon, but Israel still says they're staying as long as it takes. Israeli forces have been targeting the Iran-backed terror group Hezbollah in Lebanon, even as Israel has hammered out a ceasefire with Lebanon's government. And Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, says what happens there isn't any of Iran's business.
I don't understand why Iran is trying to interfere, sabotage those negotiations. At the end of the day, we want to see a free Lebanon with the control of the Lebanese government, the Lebanese military, and without the presence of the proxies of Iran.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the military won't leave its security zone in southern Lebanon and will continue to carry out strikes against threats there. Iran says any Israeli presence voids the deal. The White House disagrees. Tehran claimed it shut the Strait of Hormuz over the weekend over Israel's actions, but U.S. Central Command said that's false and tankers were still moving through. Colombia will once again be led by a conservative government. The second largest country in South America by population went to the polls for Sunday's runoff election and picked a conservative political outsider backed by President Trump. World's Benjamin Eicher has more.
Voters were faced with a stark choice. Leftist lawmaker Iván Cepeda campaigned in the mold of outgoing President Gustavo Petro, the nation's first socialist leader. Opposing him was businessman Abelardo de la Espriella, whose supporters call El Tigre, the tiger, due to his tough-on-crime platform. He vowed to crack down on cartels and reforge stronger ties with the U.S. The celebration was citywide, with residents honking horns and launching fireworks, as Colombian flags waved from high-rise windows. In the end, it was a tight race, decided by roughly 1 percentage point. But the country is returning to its familiar center-right governance. President Trump has endorsed Espriella, predicting he would lead Colombia to a new height of greatness. For World, I'm Benjamin Eicher.
It's so hot in France that authorities have banned public drinking and shut hundreds of schools. About a third of the country is under a red alert. Temperatures hit 104 degrees Sunday, and today's forecast is hotter still, and air conditioning there is rare. The heat is also turning deadly. Several people, including 4 children, have drowned seeking relief in the water. Spain, Italy, Germany, and the UK are baking amid a heat wave. At the weekend box office, Buzz, Woody, and the gang are back in Toy Story 5.
We're finding more abandoned toys each day.
We're down!
Tech's invaded our house, too.
I don't know, Jesse. Toys are for play, but tech is for everything.
The latest installment of Pixar's enduring franchise hauled in an estimated $160 million in its opening weekend and more than $300 million globally. That's the second biggest opening of the year behind the Super Mario Galaxy movie. Steven Spielberg's Disclosure Day finished a distant second with another $17 million in ticket sales. I'm Kristen Flavin. Straight ahead, David Bahnsen is here for Moneybeat, plus the legacy of the Liberty Bell. This is The World and Everything in It.
It's Monday, the 22nd of June. Glad to have you along for today's edition of The World and Everything in It. Good morning. I'm Jenny Ruff.
And I'm Nick Eicher. Time now for Legal Docket. The Supreme Court handed down 3 opinions last week. We'll begin with a significant Second Amendment gun case called United States versus Himani. Picture this. A husband regularly takes his wife's Ambien. It's a prescription drug to help him sleep, even though that's technically illegal. A college student routinely takes his friend's Adderall, prescription drug, to cram for exams. Again, technically illegal. Those are the examples Justice Neil Gorsuch gave as he explained why a law that bans illegal drug users from owning a firearm is unconstitutional. It's simply too sweeping. The judgment of the court was unanimous, liberals joining conservatives on a Second Amendment case and affirming a lower court's ruling.
I discussed the significance of the case with William Wagner.
Well, this really is a case about constitutional power and the way that the government structures power in the Constitution.
Wagner is a constitutional law scholar with the Faith and Freedom Center at Spring Arbor University in Michigan.
But then, even more importantly, how the Constitution limits the exercise of power by those who we, the people, give that power to.
The Constitution gives Congress the power to create laws that regulate commerce, including the shipping and transportation of guns.
And so they wrote this law, and you can find it in the United States Code in Title 18, Section 922.
The Gun Control Act. It prohibits gun possession by any person who is an unlawful user of or addicted to any controlled substance. In other words, the act bans a class of people from owning a firearm, and the defendant in this case falls into that class.
Ali Hamani is a dual citizen of the United States and Pakistan and lives in Texas. Suspecting that Himani might be involved in terrorism, the government got a search warrant and went through the home where he lived with his parents. The government found marijuana, cocaine, and a gun. During the search, Himani admitted he uses marijuana regularly, about every other day.
More than 6 months later, the government brought only one charge: possessing a firearm while being a user of marijuana.
So now you've got the federal government and the executive branch using power as well. They're using their power to enforce this law through a federal prosecution, and they prosecute him under this statute that
Hamani's lawyers challenged that statute. They said the law violated his Second Amendment right.
And so now we see how this constitutional process is supposed to work. What the Supreme Court was faced with was the question of whether or not the federal government had used its power in a way that interfered with one of our inalienable fundamental liberties.
In other words, did the government cross the line from permissible regulation into unconstitutional infringement? The court said yes, it did. But Wagner says the real key to this case is how the court decided that.
How did they get to the conclusion that the federal government was unlawfully and unconstitutionally interfering with that liberty protected by the Second Amendment? Well, the way they did it is they said, we're going to start looking at the Constitution and we're going to say what it says.
The court began its analysis by acknowledging the Constitution protects the right of all Americans to keep and bear arms for self-defense. It also acknowledged that individual rights have limits. But when it came to the limit, the court pointed out that the gun regulation does not consider what the controlled substance is, how much he uses, whether the drug makes him dangerous, why he keeps a gun, and how safely he does so. There's no inquiry, just a ban.
Here is Justice Gorsuch grappling with that last March during oral argument.
So we don't even know the quantity of how much he uses every other day. What if he took one gummy bear to help him sleep every other day? Disarm him for life?
Now, if the government can show that its gun law is consistent with the nation's history and tradition of regulating firearms, it can likely overcome the presumption that the law is unconstitutional.
The government did make that attempt, namely pointing out that early American laws deprived another class of people from firearm rights: historical drunkards.
Drinking was a huge problem in early America.
I called up this law professor who a few years ago clerked for Justice Gorsuch. Lyle Weinberger is a professor of constitutional law at George Mason University.
The rates of alcohol consumption were very, very high.
Weinberger notes that his old boss seemed to enjoy writing this opinion.
He's clearly someone who loves history, loves digging into this, and I thought this opinion was actually a very fun read because Justice Gorsuch digs into the history of drunkenness in early America and has some very colorful and entertaining historical materials in here.
Like the story of Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a medical doctor. His medical reports had comments from a habitual drunkard.
Who says, "We're a keg of rum in one corner of the room and a cannon constantly firing between me and it. I still couldn't help myself from running in front of the cannon in order to get to the rum." And that's what Dr. Rush said one of his patients said in describing his addiction.
Excessive drinking is a serious problem. But to deprive habitual drunkards of their liberties, the government had to show the extreme alcohol use incapacitated them or caused them to be incapable of conducting affairs.
The reason all of this stuff about drunkenness matters is because as the government made their claims, they made a very sweeping and very aggressive argument. The government wanted to say, we want a bright line rule where it's really easy to disarm people if you can show that the person we're trying to disarm used a controlled substance.
Today's law assumes that anyone who regularly uses drugs in an unqualified way is categorically dangerous. There's no individualized analysis. Also, the automatic ban comes without any formal steps before the liberty is lost.
And basically what all the justices of the Supreme Court ultimately agree on is that that's asking too much. The Second Amendment, yes, of course, they leave the acknowledgement that it permits the government to disarm someone who is actually dangerous. But merely showing, for instance, that someone used their spouse's Ambien, a prescribed sleeping medication, in an unauthorized way, is not going to be sufficient to just say, oh, you are automatically prohibited from exercising Second Amendment rights.
A number of justices wrote concurrences to hash out finer points. For the first time ever, conservative Justice Samuel Alito and liberal Justice Elena Kagan joined for a concurrence of their own. Alito pointed out that even though federal law still criminalizes marijuana possession, many states have legalized it, and the federal government has allowed a multi-billion-dollar marijuana industry to develop.
But the debate over the adverse effects of marijuana remains heated. Alito and Kagan seem to imply that disarmament on the basis of incapacitation might also be okay, without a separate showing of dangerousness.
So perhaps the Alito-Kagan view would allow the government to disarm more people who are drug users, so show that they are habitual users of drugs, such that leads them to long-term incapacitation.
Overall, both the professors I talked to agreed this case followed an originalist analysis. And that brings me back to what Professor Wagner said at the beginning about the importance of starting with the Constitution and what the law says.
That is really important, not just in this Second Amendment case, but it's really important for people of faith and for people that care about freedom of expression, because when the government interferes with the free exercise of religious conscience, the language of our Constitution is clear. Government, you don't get to do that. And so in all these cases that are dividing our culture out there, and very often where you see exercises of government power coming against people of faith in ways that oppress their ability to share the full counsel of the Bible, for example. Now the court's going to, I hope, continue this trend and say, well, we're going to go back first and start with the Constitution. And I think it's the one thing that really separates us from all the other nations in the world.
All right, on to our second case now, Hunter versus the United States and limits to plea bargaining. The government charged Mason Hunter with 10 counts of fraud. If convicted, he'd be facing 300 years in prison. Instead of a trial, he entered a plea agreement.
Here's Professor Wagner again.
When I say plea agreement, think contract.
Most criminal defendants do this today. They plead guilty, and as part of the bargain, the government drops some of the charges. Here, 9 of them. In the plea, Hunter agreed not to appeal his sentence.
That's part of the whole deal, is we're trying to not have to have a whole bunch of cases go to court, have a whole bunch of cases that we've got to expend resources on, and lawyers responding to appeals. And what happened here was the guy had entered into that agreement, and then he appealed.
The Supreme Court had to decide whether an exception applies to appeal waivers. Justice Kagan delivered the 8-1 opinion. It outlined 3 positions the court could take. First, it could agree with the government that appeal waivers are always enforceable no matter what. Second, it could agree with the lower court here that appeal waivers are unenforceable under only one exception. The sentence imposed exceeds the statutory maximum. Or third, it could take the position of the majority of lower courts, that the waivers are unenforceable when it would result in a miscarriage of justice. That third position is where the court landed. It sent the case back to apply that standard. Justice Clarence Thomas filed the lone dissenting opinion.
I asked Wagner to break it down.
And he points out that thanks to this agreement that the government gave him, this guy got a really, really low sentence compared to what he would have got. And he got all these other advantages. And what Thomas is saying, you put it into a contract. You signed your name on it that you agree not to appeal. And so the contract, under contract principles, Thomas has a pretty good point here.
Thomas also said the court decision was based on policy, not law.
And now finally, TM versus the University of Maryland Medical System Corporation. The facts involve a woman who was involuntarily committed, but the legal issue centers on the relationship between state courts and federal courts. We have 51 different governments in this country, 50 state governments and 1 federal.
Professor Weinberger again.
And the fact that we have a double system in our country because of federalism just means that these things are complicated. And sometimes you have parallel courts. They both have jurisdiction of the same thing, and people have a choice of which system they go to with what questions. And that can be good. It can also lead to lots of complications, duplication of effort, inefficiency, and things of that nature.
The courts need rules to manage them, like the Rooker-Feldman doctrine. That says a party who does not like a state court decision cannot appeal it to a lower federal court. In a 5-4 decision written by Justice Sonia Sotomayor, the court upheld that doctrine and said it applies whether or not the state court case is finished.
These doctrines really matter for the real life experience of cases. And, calibrate it too far in one direction, you're keeping people out of federal court because, you have the state courts. Well, that might lead to some overall efficiency.
But on the other hand, their federal issues might not all get dealt with. Justice Amy Coney Barrett wrote a dissent joined by Chief Justice John Roberts and Justices Kagan and Gorsuch to say there are certain ways to move from state to federal court, and she thought that the majority opinion muddied the rules.
The takeaway, that it's hard to manage the state-federal relationship and two parallel judicial systems at the same time. 17 more opinions to go, and we're in the final stretch. The court is expected to issue more tomorrow around 10 a.m. Eastern, so stay tuned. For now, that's this week's Legal Docket.
Additional support comes from Asbury University, where students grow in Christ, prepare for careers, and build lifelong connections in Kentucky or online. asbury.edu. From Nuggets of Wisdom, digital homeschool curriculum, unit studies, and educational resources for growing minds. nuggets-of-wisdom.com. And from Ascend by Unbound, a real-world faith-centered college alternative for gap year, trades, and degree-seeking students. More at beunbound.us/world.
Coming up next on The World and Everything in It, the Monday Moneybeat.
Time now to talk business markets and the economy with financial analyst and advisor David Bahnsen. David heads up the wealth management firm, the Bahnsen Group, and he is here now. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Nick. Good to be with you.
Well, David, let's begin with the first Federal Reserve meeting chaired by Kevin Warsh. One of the themes of that press conference last week was that financial markets have become too focused on the Fed itself. Let's have a listen to this.
So I think financial markets perform best when they react to incoming data. I think the financial markets work less efficiently when they ask a question, how will the Federal Reserve react to that incoming information? The more that markets are paying attention to what's happening in the real economy, deciding what's good data and what's less good data, financial market prices are probably the most important source of information to guide central bankers.
Well, David, that struck me as a pretty remarkable thing for a Fed chairman to say. For years now, we've lived in this world where investors seem obsessed with guessing what the Fed is going to do next, and we talk about that quite a bit. At least there's a lot of media coverage to that effect, but Warsh seems to be saying that's exactly the problem. What is he trying to accomplish here?
Well, there's a number of things going on, but I think they can be reduced to that, the way he positioned it, as wanting economic activity to be about economic activity. Folks interpreting data, drawing conclusions, implementing, decisions, as opposed to a heavy over focus on what the Fed is going to think about data. This is something he essentially said word for word, and it was the highlight of the press conference, in my opinion. But it is something that I've been talking about for a very long time. And what I want people to understand is how systemic it's become, that so much of financial market activity since the financial crisis has become what I think is an accurate use of the term financialization, where the focus becomes less on productive activity, the producing of goods and services, the risk-taking and economic calculation that goes around that organic, normal economic activity, and instead limited to a framework of either guessing what the Fed is going to do or guessing what others are going to think the Fed is going to do, and it's limited productive investment, it's limited productive capital spending. And Warsh is completely, totally against it. He has talked about the elimination of forward guidance. Now, let's point out that they did still release a dot plot where the other Fed governors said where they thought rates were going. But what he did, which was pretty clever, was first of all, you had half say they don't think anything's going to change and half say they think they're going to raise a rate, which is basically a break even. And then one person didn't do it at all. That person was him. So they did the very best they could at basically giving something that didn't mean anything, which to me sounds like pulling forward guidance. The written statement itself was dramatically reduced, a very truncated version. Again, less copy content, elaboration around it, and more just bottom line conclusion, because people want to take what the Fed has said and then use it to try to speculate about future activity. Warsh wants to put an end to that, and I think it's very healthy.
And I suspected, David, when I heard that press conference that you were going to love what Kevin Warsh had to say. But let's bring this out of the world of traders and economists for a moment. What does all of this matter to the average world listener, would you say? What's the practical takeaway from a Federal Reserve chairman trying to pull the Fed back from the center of every single market conversation?
Well, there's world listeners that are investors. There's world listeners that are borrowers. There's world listeners that maybe are lenders. I mean, there's all sorts of economic hats that we wear. And I think when we're functioning in God's creation, and I think that what I would say to people who are aware of it and people who maybe aren't as aware of it is that we've all been living in an economy for quite some time where the Fed has quite a bit of input, quite a bit of influence, that their heavy degree of interventions in financial markets have an impact. I'm not one who holds to a sinister view of their motive in this. I very much believe that they believe that they are doing the right thing to try to create better stability and better conditions towards their congressionally mandated dual mandate, which is price stability and maximum employment. But good intentions don't mean that they've done the right thing. And by the Fed taking a more aggressive role in the economy, it affects all of us. Sometimes it may not be a bad thing, but it's a distortive thing. It alters the way that something is to go. And my view in an economy of free men and women freely transacting, making decisions, and not having someone that's there trying to kind of master plan and steward it, that you get a better outcome than when you have a heavy input from this sort of central entity. And I think that we've gotten a heavy input from a central entity known as the Federal Reserve. Warsh is not getting rid of all this today or tomorrow. Their fingerprints into things are deep. They're in a lot of ways. But I think he has put down a gauntlet of an incremental withdrawal from some of the heaviest interventions that the Fed has been a part of. What does that mean to average world listener? I hope it will mean a removal of a very big imposition into economic activity that I think will restore healthier, more organic economic activity. And by the way, there could be negatives that come from this, but in the sense that a lot of times a patient can feel better by taking more and more morphine, but they're doing more damage. And I think that the Fed sometimes we can have the illusion that they're helping things when in reality they're keeping the patient sicker for longer. I have no doubt that that's happened for over 20 years now.
Well, now, another thing that caught my attention was Warsh's rejection of a long-standing assumption in economics that stronger growth and stronger employment necessarily come with a trade-off, namely higher inflation. Listen to what he says here.
I don't believe that we have a cruel choice. I don't share the view that was expressed a few generations ago that Federal Reserve chairmen show up at a podium like this and say, you got to choose. And you're going to have to decide whether you're willing to tolerate higher inflation to put more people at work. I don't believe in that.
Now, that is a pretty direct challenge to a way of thinking that has influenced central banking for decades, David. What exactly is Warsh pushing back against there, and why does it matter?
Well, it's the first Fed chair of my life that I happen to know ideologically is not a Phillips curver, and then the first Fed chair to say that. So what I mean by that is the Phillips curve is an economic model that basically posits that when you have strong employment, it creates inflationary pressures. The strong employment puts upward pressure on wages, and when people are making more money, that pushes prices higher, and you get a negative spiral that this growth creates inflationary responses. The problem with the model is it was disproven so thoroughly in inverse in 1970s that we found out actually you can have high inflation and very low wages and high unemployment. And if it doesn't work one way, then it doesn't work the other way. But my argument as a free marketeer is that its fundamental flaw is to misunderstand that inflation is a monetary phenomena and growth is a healthy thing that often puts downward pressure on prices because of competition. So there's so much economic philosophy that goes into refuting Phillips curve. This stuff is stuff I've basically been passionate about my whole adult life. And Kevin Warsh is the first Fed chair. There's been other Fed chair people that would have nuanced their support of Phillips curve, but Warsh is a vehement anti-Phillips curver, and so is David Bahnsen.
All right, so before we go, Fed Chairman Warsh closed his first ever FOMC press conference by returning to that same theme. As he wrapped up, he said this.
Trends matter more than data points. What's happening over 3 or 6 months matters more than any one data point, any one data release. And I'd say the jobs data has been moving in a good direction. If I heard one other thing around that subject over the course of the last couple of days, what I heard was that strong productivity-led growth is not something that we fear, but something we embrace.
Now, that was the final thought that he had. I mean, his next words were thank you, and then he grabbed his notebook and left. Why do you think he wanted to leave people thinking about productivity?
Well, it matters because he is setting the stage for where you could have low unemployment and good GDP growth and not believe you have to raise rates, not believe you have to be phobic or tighten money just because economic growth is good. Now, he also was adamant that he is there to generate price stability and that inflation is a choice. So he is not suggesting they need to go ease money either. But to me, everything he said was that you should not assume if we have productive economic growth, it means that inflation is coming. And Warsh is right about that. And I believe he is going to prove to be less hawkish than people believe, but not recklessly dovish either.
All right, David Bahnsen, founder, managing partner, and chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group. David writes at dividendcafe.com and at World Opinions. David, thank you and have a great week.
Thanks so much, Nick.
Good morning. This is The World and Everything in It from listener-supported World Radio. I'm Jenny Ruff.
And I'm Nick Eicher. Next up on the World History Book, The Sound of Freedom. On June 6, 1944, the mayor of Philadelphia struck the Liberty Bell on the side 7 times, once for each letter in the word liberty. It was D-Day, and the bell rang as Allied forces invaded Normandy.
The 7 strokes of liberty from the world-famed Liberty Bell.
It's one of the only recordings of the bell after a major fracture famously appeared in the 1800s. The bell is one of the most iconic symbols of freedom in America. from its daily use during the Revolutionary War to a rallying cry during the movement for abolition.
But its story has transformed through legends, myths, and a collective memory of the American founding. World's Emma Eicher has the story.
For more than 250 years, the Liberty Bell has found its home in Philadelphia. It used to ring from the steeple of the Pennsylvania State House.
Go see the big bell?
Today, it hangs from a wooden yoke made of elm, safe behind glass at the downtown Liberty Bell Center. Tourist Gary Clausen is visiting historical sites, and he says the bell is one of his first stops.
There's a whole lot of awesome stuff about our nation's history, things that we need to remember, be able to cherish.
Although the bell is now known as a symbol of freedom, it hasn't always been. Its story has become mythologized and deeply embedded in the cultural memory of America's founding. The bell was commissioned in 1751 from the Whitechapel Bell Foundry in London. Then it made the voyage to Philadelphia.
And it arrived in August of 1752.
That's Michael Haddam. He's the author of The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History. He says after the bell arrived on the docks, someone decided to ring it for the first time.
And it cracked on the spot. You can imagine the horror of many of the onlookers. They'd been waiting a long time for this bell to be delivered, to have it crack right on the dock was quite upsetting.
The crack was so large, the bell had to be completely melted down and recast.
They delivered it to the city, to the assembly in Philadelphia, and they rang the bell, and it sounded awful.
So they melted it down and recast it again. The second time, the ringing sounded only marginally better. Pennsylvania State University students created a digital model of what it might have sounded like originally. For nearly 90 years, it rang through Philadelphia to call lawmakers to meetings and summon townspeople for public announcements. Then the bell fell silent in the 1840s, after a crack appeared in the bronze. That's around the same time that the bell became a recognized symbol of liberty in the abolition movement. Its engraved Bible verse resounded with principles of equality and freedom.
The verse is Leviticus 25:10. The verse reads, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof."
The verse refers to the biblical Year of Jubilee in the Old Testament, where Israelites returned property and freed their slaves every 50 years. And when the bell cracked, it took on even more meaning.
It seemed to sort of symbolize the split in the nation over slavery in these years.
As the Liberty Bell grew in significance, so did the legends surrounding it. Many of them have to do with the exact date and cause of the famous crack. Some say it happened in 1824, while tradition points to the funeral of Chief Justice John Marshall in 1835. Still others suggest it happened on George Washington's birthday in February 1846. The story goes that the bell was already damaged and stopped ringing for good.
One Philadelphia newspaper said that the bell had been irretrievably broken and rendered dumb.
Another popular tale is that the bell rang on Independence Day 1776. Although it likely did, scholars haven't found any historical evidence. Haddam says these myths strengthen the cultural memory of the American Revolution.
The way the revolution lives on is through the stories, right? And the stories that we tell about it and the meanings that we attribute to it. And symbols like the Liberty Bell.
And it's through the shared language of the founding, like liberty, freedom, tyranny, and equality, that Americans find a shared identity.
We do all fundamentally agree that those ideals are important, even if we don't all agree on how we define them. And so in some sense, there is this sort of underlying consensus to our political culture, and that comes from the revolution and how we tell the stories about it.
Every year, millions of Americans visit the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. Tourist Gary Clausen says it's a reminder of founding ideals.
We fought a lot for the chance to be free and to have the inspiration to be able to keep that going for future generations.
Although the bell sits silent now, its story continues to resonate throughout American history. That's this week's World History Book. I'm Emma Eicher in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Tomorrow, the Federal Trade Commission takes a leading medical association to court over transgender procedures for kids. We'll have a report. And the challenges of learning to read as an adult. That and more tomorrow. I'm Jenny Ruff.
And I'm Nick Eicher. The World and Everything in It comes to you from World Radio. World's mission is biblically objective journalism that informs, educates, and inspires. The Bible says, "Owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Verses 8 through 10 of Romans chapter 13. Go now in grace and peace.